The album starts with The Well, which is inspired by an interaction that Jesus has with a woman in the gospel, where they are standing beside a well, and she is a Samaritan woman, is also has a reputation for sleeping with different men. And so in her culture, she's been very scorned and very judged and very mistreated. This is one of the first times where we see Jesus revealing his divine identity, where he talks about being the water of life. And I have always found that very interesting. I've personally doubted God a lot, and doubted especially Jesus being the way to God. I've just kind of gone back and forth a lot in my life, honestly. And in that point where we see Jesus addressing that woman, I see Jesus transcending culture and time, and doing something that really elevates a woman above other men, which is unheard of in his culture, as well as even to this day in that part of the world. That is something that you just really don't see, is that equality of men and women. And that's always really stuck with me, that Jesus didn't see her as this Samaritan, or didn't see her as an adulterer, but saw her as a sister, as a lover, and treated her as an equal. That always will stick with me, and really for me shows the divinity that Jesus was representing. So that is The Well. XX City Grave is very much a flash forward. It takes place in a current day setting, and it is about one of many women in America who has been sex trafficked from another country and is enslaved in what we think is the land of the free. It deals with not only the actual handcuffs, the actual chains that keep this lady in her bed, but also a culture of apathy about the nature of evil and an overall ignorance about sex trafficking. And this also deals with pornography and the male gaze. This song deals with the struggle for women to be seen not as objects, and to not be merely something to be gazed at, but to understand women as human beings, which may seem basic, but I think is actually lacking in the male perspective for a lot of people in this country and in our culture. That's what XX City Grave deals with, and honestly the religious failings of so many Christians and other people who claim to be about justice and reconciliation, but allow misogyny to creep into their sermons. Our third track is an interlude called I Drowned in the Desert, and that line, as well as the other interlude, which is To Thirst for the Sea, is taken from our original EP, Come Wind, Come Weather, and it sort of deals with the metaxis that a lot of our album deals with, this being between, that we always want what is often going to kill us, and we have this strange desire and drive sort of towards our own fatalities, what Freud would call the death instinct. A poet that I really enjoy, Francis Buechner, once said about lust, he said, the craving of salt for a man who's dying of thirst. And so that sort of small description of what lust is in a very succinct sentence kind of led me to write that lyric. So yes, that is I Drowned in the Desert. Next song is Native Blood, which I think has become probably our favorite song to play live, because the crowd interaction has been very passionate, and I think the issue is very specific and very passionate. It's about the serial mistreatment of Native Americans in what we know as America. This song deals with really not only the physical genocide, the killing of Native American people that happened as America began to colonize and move west, but also the cultural genocide that we saw, like in the Dawes Act that was passed in the 1800s, where Native Americans were relocated from their lands into other lands and basically disconnected from the earth, which is essential to any form of spirituality, not just Native American spirituality, but especially in Native American spirituality. So I think that this disconnect from the earth, from one another, from their loved ones, shipping off children to boarding schools where they had to cut their hair and had to abandon their languages and would be disciplined, is really a cultural genocide. It's when you pretty much take everything of meaning from a people group and try to whitewash them. And that's something that America has done for a very long time. and I think is only recently beginning to realize and reconcile. Native blood in particular has evoked a lot of interesting discussions, even sometimes maybe debates, probably just for those YouTube people who like debating each other. Debate below in this video. I've had Native American people come up to me, and I'm a very small amount Native American, but I've had Native American people approach me at shows and say that this song means a lot to them, which is probably the most humbling experience, to know that I can write something and that God can use music to sort of connect people from different places in life. And it's actually caused my band to learn more about Native Americans, really realize that the conditions that a lot of Native American people live in today, especially in the reservations, was really caused very systematically and directly by a country that thought it was acting under freedom and under the guise of manifest destiny that God had given them coast to coast. And in reality, I think that's a political lie that we deal with. So that's Native Blood. Tiny Hands' Au Revoir was the first song that we ever wrote. We actually wrote that song in December of 2012. And Tiny Hands deals with a specific historical event when a lady named Madame Rufanche was, along with her village of women and children, was locked into a church while the men were taken outside and shot by Nazi SS troops. This was in June of 1944. People say that it was Nazi retaliation for hiding Jews, as well as plans from civilians to sabotage the Nazi battle plans. This lady was locked in a church with a bunch of other women and children, and they were shooting bullets through the stained glass windows and set the church on fire. Despite being shot several times, she managed to leap miraculously high into the air through a window and hide among pea plants for a few days. And that story evokes so much emotion and honestly anger at the misogyny and at the false concepts of God that could guide anyone to justify such a war crime, that I wanted to tell her story, which I feel like was not very much known, and sort of tell more stories. So it all really started with Tiny Hands, and I think her testimony after she testified and she said, "I am the mother of the dying, the dust, I have nothing." So her incredibly sad story, and by the way, I don't think any Nazi troops thought that anyone had survived. So she walks in, she's been shot several times. She hid in a garden for a few days, which has pretty incredible sort of metaphorical insight. And she gave this testimony, which kind of had pointed out who was in charge of this war crime. And it was kind of an incredible, very sad event, but also I think evoked a lot of emotion for me and a lot of people, and showed sort of the beauty of good triumphing over evil, not in a domination sense, but in a sense of like, you can't expel love from this earth. You can't expel love from this lady, no matter the evil that you commit. So that's Tiny Hands. Firstwake is a dialogue that I sort of imagined between Mary and Jesus on the cross. Hearing the crucifixion story, as most people have, something that I've always thought was interesting and often sort of looked over by evangelical religious culture is the idea of Mary watching, first of all, an innocent man, second of all, the Son of God, and third, her own son dying. I think that of all people who are just shocked by the utter violence and brutality and sort of evil winning, as it seemed at the time of the cross, I think Mary had the most painful. And in one of the Gospels, Jesus even tells his disciple, I believe it was John, to take care of her. And so you see this incredible love for Jesus, for his mother, and for his mother for Jesus. And I really wanted to sort of get into not only that dialogue, but also the femininity of God. I think several times I've seen people saying, did he just describe God as mother? And the answer is yes. I don't believe God is a male or God is a female, but I believe that God is constantly offending our political imaginations and is really moving us from one place where we think we're comfortable and we have things figured out into a whole nother dialogue and a whole nother paradigm. I would describe that as really exploring the femininity of God. A train's coming, so that's Firstwake. Darkstrand Hibakusha deals with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan of August 1945. And I think that everyone's probably familiar with that historical event. And sort of contrary to most of the stories we tell, this is one that's very central to the political imagination, I guess, that we're given. And what I think is really interesting about dealing with this tragedy on the side of a small Japanese girl is it really did upset a lot of listeners, because they feel like it's sort of maybe a betrayal of being an American to understand the perspective of a person from Japan who's hurt. And I guess what I would say to that is, as a Christian, I sort of give up my identity as anything other than a follower of Christ. And I think that's a really radical idea, and an idea that a lot of countries don't like, because I really do believe that's what we see in the gospel is that we renounce what we think makes us us, or what other people tell us, like you're this, you're that, and say that I'm actually a Christ follower. And so I think as a Christ follower, and as someone who studies an idea called liberation theology, I believe that my faith leads me to identify with the marginalized of society and people who are sort of pushed aside, and people who don't have a voice, people that don't have rights. And so I believe that when I look at a situation like this, instead of sort of taking sides and debating, Japan, America, like who was right in a war, which I don't know if there is such a thing. It's just so sad to see death happen, especially on such a magnitude. I want to identify with people who are victimized, and that would absolutely be civilians that were just incinerated and their shadows were burnt into the ground. This song deals with a young girl kind of running to find her mother's shadow, and contemplating the strange nature of the human ability to not only give life but also to take it a lot away, in sort of an anti-creative mode of humanity. First Mother, Lilith, is, I think, the song that maybe I've been asked about the most since we released that, which is interesting because we haven't really played it live or promoted it that much, but I think that a lot of people are really interested in Lilith and the mythology of Lilith, myself included. I'm sort of pulling Lilith not from the medieval tales of a demon succubus, but instead actually from the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, where you see this woman who came before Eve, and the little that we know about Lilith is that she refused to sort of be lesser than Adam or lay under Adam, so she was cast out of the garden. And I think it's really interesting that from their mythology makes her into be the scorned demon lady who's out to haunt men and seduce them. I think it kind of goes to show the foil that women are placed in our imaginations. Women are either this ideal object of a submitting woman, or they're, I guess, evil and sexual deviants, So I really wanted to explore the story of Lilith, because I think it's interesting that she didn't want to lay under Adam, that she didn't understand herself necessarily as like second to Adam. And this is the issue that I think humanity has been dealing with for so long, of violence and gender and sexual orientation, is like, the way that we're created, the way that we're made, the way that we're looked, should that dictate our function or value? You see it happening before even the story of Genesis, or during the story of Genesis. So I sort of wrote an imagined dialogue between Lilith and Eve and Adam, and it's definitely raised more questions than answers, I think, for me. And I'm not really someone who gets caught up in like, is it real? Like, did it happen? Because I think a lot of the most real things that I've ever discovered I can't point to physically. So whether this story occurred in a physical sense doesn't make it any less real, I think, for me and for a lot of people. So it's an interesting thing. And also Rory from Dayseeker makes it incredibly more fun to listen to when he sings, because he's real good at that. To Thirst for the Sea is the second half of The Lion I Drowned in the Desert, To Thirst for the Sea. And that song in particular was written as an extension of First Mother, which, by the way, First Mother we've also had written for like a long time, like almost 2 years. And it was supposed to flow together, but I liked that interlude so much that I would often find myself just wanting to listen to that. So I didn't want people to have to scrub through First Mother just to get to that. So we really wanted to just like isolate it as its own interlude. That piece, I think, above pretty much anything we've ever written, I would love to listen to. And if I had to be stuck on an island, that would probably be one thing I'd want to listen to, is just that sort of haunting but I don't know, maybe somewhat like hopeful melody that's going on through that whole piece. Wasteland Vishnost is another slightly older song on our album. It deals with another historical event. A lady named Julia Busobra. She was a school teacher and a wife of a politician in the Soviet Union. And after the war, she was suspected of aiding the underground church, which she was. And so she was taken to a labor camp in Siberia. And it was there that, according to her autobiography called The Woman Who Could Not Die, she was shot several times and tortured. And it was expected that she would die and her captors would come back and still find her alive again and again. I don't know whether they were like spooked out or they didn't know what to do or she had served her time, but she was released from this detention and brought back and was kind of a hero of the underground church. And she wrote this poem that I didn't have enough space in the song to put in, but she said, "I'm love, I'm eternity, I move from being to being, I am peace, and the more violence perpetrated against me by my captors, the more that I love them and the more that I cannot die." And her idea is that love is the opposite of death, and that the harder they tried to kill her, God within her just responded with more and more love for her captors. And she loved these people so much that she couldn't die at their hands because everything they did to her was almost love, because that's how she absorbed it. So her story is really incredible and really inspired me to write Wasteland. Depths 2 is a very emotional song for myself and the entirety of our band. It's what we typically end our set with. I have struggled with different mental illnesses and I've received conflicting diagnoses, and maybe I won't label myself on a camera, but you could say that I'm not always well, I think, in my mind. I'm not always the mark of wellness. And I wrote Depths 2 in a particularly dark place in my life where I was very hopeless and had very few things that I wished to live for, which is why I start the song by saying all the world was a dream I couldn't shake, because I feel like anyone who's struggled maybe with depression or anxiety or maybe even suicide has maybe felt that numbness of moving through reality but feeling like this is not very real. Things that are tactile are like I'm not even feeling, like being very like existentially removed maybe. And so I wrote that in that place, and I during that time had a dream that was very vivid. Maybe I'd call it a vision. I saw myself sort of in this house and alone, and it kind of described what it is to be depressed or anxious, is you just feel so isolated and like no one can actually get to you or help you. And I just in my madness, I go out the door and I think I'm seeing things and hearing things, and I sort of go across this clearing and see the women, the 7 women that are the characters in The Night God Slept, and they're moving in a circle, and I don't really know what it means. They're moving around this fire, and then I hear a voice from the fire, which I would describe as God, sort of as the Israelites saw God as this cloud of smoke that was over them. Something that's not tangible. I think fire is almost a perfect idea to understand God, because you can't hold God or grasp God or make God do what you want God to do. But there's this freedom and there's this almost amorphous nature in this fire. So I see them turning around, and then I once again sort of find myself asking the question that I asked in Come When Come Weather on our original Depths 1, which was, Lord, did you see me as I was dreaming? Which is a reference to something that I feel like I've gone through a lot of my life, ignoring what's important and not really being there, and God asking me to be here, and me sort of just wandering in my mind and losing track, just like the disciples did in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so I was sort of there, and then it ends with, but I caught fire, and it's me sort of finding the passion to live again, finding the Holy Spirit taking control of me, and something that I can't fully explain, something I don't want to write a systematic theology about it. I just want to show you what that love looks like if I ever meet you, if we can ever get food together or hang out at a show. That is The Night God Slept. It's a story, I guess, of love against the machine. It's a story of hope. It's a story of, I think, dealing with suffering in a real manner and not wanting to just pull an easy moral lesson from suffering, because sometimes suffering does seem very senseless. And I think as a Christian, I would like to maybe right the wrongs of some of the Christians who have gone before me and said, I have the definitive answer on everything, because I don't. I think the more that I live and I grow closer to God, I have more questions than answers. It's my story of struggling with these events, past and present and future. Also really wanting to challenge the idea that God is a man, that God is white, that God is American, and really understand that our concepts of God will always be limiting. Our speech about God will always be limiting. And it doesn't mean that we need to stop thinking or speaking about God, but I think it would do us a lot of good to understand God as that homeless dude that you pass on the way to work, or to understand God as a transvestite stripper who's been condemned and pushed out of everywhere. To understand God, I think we first need to go to the margins of our society and those who offend our political imaginations. And I think that'll bring us maybe a little bit closer to getting at the gospel and what Jesus is saying. That's the night God slept. We're in a band called Silent Planet, and check out Tim. He's really cute and has a beard. Thank you.